I'm Kim Peets and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced them? In this series we take a closer look at these church leaders and we invite them to share their stories with us. Here with me is Pastor Ken Vogel, Senior Church Administrator. Hi Ken, how are you?
Hi Kim, very well.
Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now you grew up in the bush. Tell us about your life.
I did. I had a wonderful upbringing on a farm in Queensland initially.
Yes.
And just love the outdoors and love animals. Brought up on a dairy farm.
Oh, great, great. And so tell us a little bit about being on a dairy farm and how was it?
Well, as a kid, it probably was, I could say, mostly great, but I also realised there were ups and downs, as with most farming.
Yeah.
You know, there's some tough times, and I experienced with Mum and Dad some of those tough times as well as the good times. But the thing about those good times and bad times for my parents was that their Christian faith carried them through both. And I saw in my parents something extraordinary. So in my childhood upbringing, yeah, loved the outdoors and animals and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But probably one of the great influences of my life is my upbringing with Christian parents.
And was there a time that your parents' faith was challenged?
Oh yes, certainly. There were many times, you know, that was challenged, but the one that is very clear in my memory was when my little brother died on the farm. That was a huge challenge. It tests anybody's faith, you know. Mum and Dad believed in the truths of God's Word, and they were precious to them. The Bible was precious to them, but for them it was a living faith, and when my brother died, that was a huge test. It was just a tragic story.
What happened, Ken?
Oh, look, I recall it so graphically. My little brother was 3 years of age. It was a Friday afternoon. We're preparing for the Sabbath. And I was in the veggie garden getting veggies, and Dad was milking the cows. Mum was at the house preparing for the Sabbath. And my little brother was helping Dad, you know, 3 years old, helping.
Very helpful.
But, you know, he was doing his thing, you know, getting the cows in while Dad was milking and so on. But then he disappeared, and Dad just thought he must have gone over to the house.
Yeah.
But tragically he hadn't. He was doing his typical toddler thing and was playing at the water trough. And so when Dad came home and found he wasn't there, you know, it was just, where's Leonard? And it was just, so hard to tell the story even to this day, you know, because anyway, he was found and yeah, couldn't revive him. Yeah, it was.
So sorry, Ken.
Yeah,
that's awful. That's a truly awful story, and I'm sure that many people can relate to, you know, deaths on farms and things like that.
Yeah, well, you know, it is, and people do go through it. It's very real that innocent little ones do die, and how my parents handled that, Kim, really was a great transition point in my life, because I saw them grieve, and they still grieve. As you can see, I still feel it immensely. But they held on to their faith, you know. The Bible says that Jesus promises a resurrection when he comes back.
Yes.
And they absolutely believed it then, and they believe it still today, and I do too, you know. I was 12 years of age, and for me to see my parents grieve and to feel my own grief, and then to see them hang on to that faith and that hope in the resurrection is just, yeah, so real. And so, yeah, that personal faith of my parents is something that became mine as well. Not because it was my parents, but they modelled it. And now today I have those same beliefs, but I also have my own personal faith. And I look forward to the resurrection of Jesus when I see my little brother again.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for that story. Coming up next, we'll find out how Ken is able to juggle being a church minister with being a bush pilot. Thanks. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. Here with me is Senior Church Administrator, Pastor Ken Vogel. Welcome back.
Thank you.
How on earth from church pastor, you know, juggling all of your levels of church administration, bush pilot, where did that come from?
A very good question. It was out of the blue. And again, that's how God works, you know. He is amazing, where if you put your life in His hands, He'll take you to places that you'd never choose to or thought you'd go to, and certainly He'll get you to do things that you've never thought of doing.
Oh, that's so true.
Marlene, my wife, and I, we decided that we would go where God wanted us to go and do what He wanted us to do. And that has just been an amazing, exciting journey, and a bush pilot is part of that.
Oh, true. So how did that come about?
We were in the outback of Australia, and I was travelling to visit the sheep properties, the sheep stations, and there were such long distances, you know, and I was doing this for several months, and I came home one time and I said to Marlene, you know, it is just such a waste, this time driving, when all of these properties actually have little airstrips. How about I learn to fly? And so we just pulled all of our cash resources and I learned to fly. That's where it all started.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. So tell us, what did you do out in the outback, some of the ministries?
Oh, yes. The outback of Australia is just a wonderful place, and the people who live out there are fantastic. And they're innovative people, you know. And one of the things that the community in which we lived in Burke, one of the things that they decided to do was, let's have a radio station. So as a community, and Marlene and I, we joined in. We helped to build a radio station, and that began a fascinating ministry, again, that we had never dreamt about being involved in. Yes. And so, yeah, we helped to build it, and then we started a couple of programs. But one of the programs that we started was a children's story program. We called it Sunday Story. And every Sunday morning we'd have jungle doctor stories, and we'd have music for kids and various types of stories. And that program went for over 20 years.
That's amazing. That is just
we were quite
amazing.
Thrilled after we left, you know. Others carried it on, and it just continued. It became part of that community.
And now being a bush pilot, that took you further afield, didn't it? It took you overseas?
Well, it did. Flying in the outback was one thing, and that's really all I thought. But God had other plans, and that, you know, again, it's scary when you think about it, but God had other plans, and we ended up working in Papua New Guinea.
Oh, and give us a description about Papua New Guinea. A lot of people haven't been there.
Yeah, Papua New Guinea is a beautiful country, just magnificent, and it's right through the centre of the country. It's like a spine down its back of very tall mountains, and it's quite rugged. And so Papua New Guinea's flying is considered possibly to one of the most dangerous flying conditions in the world because of the terrain, but the weather patterns as well. They're all very individualised weather patterns. You can fly for 20 minutes and you'll fly from one weather pattern into a totally different weather pattern. And then on top of that, the third thing are the airstrips. They are amazing. Many of them very short, one-way airstrips. Yeah, fascinating flying.
And tell us the story or two about being a pilot in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, look, going into the isolated areas was really interesting, and because road systems just can't get through into that rugged terrain, aircraft is the only means by which people actually can access the outside world. And so people loved you coming and visiting, but as I visited around in some of the more isolated areas, one of the things that really caught my attention was the medical condition of the people. They really had great needs in some of these places, and it was tragic. The government would sometimes send a medical orderly into some of these isolated places, but often those medical orderlies would run away. That was just too isolated for them. It was too hard.
Oh my goodness.
So even where there was a government medical outpost or a church one, the Seventh Adventist Church sometimes operates clinics, where they are having those clinics, they still have difficulty in getting support. I mean, these are medical orderlies. These are not even trained nurses.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, they're great needs.
And you saw people, you know, suffering greatly with their health, didn't you?
Oh, yes. Sometimes the ulcers, you know, you'd see ulcers on the legs just eating away the legs, and the skin of some of these kids and even adults, you know, just completely covered in fungal diseases. It was tragic, and I thought, what can we do to actually help these people? And so, as a Christian, I prayed about it. I don't have an answer, so I asked God to help me know how to deal with this. And I was led to speak to the doctor in charge of our Adventist hospital. He was a Papua New Guinean, and so I went to him and I said, Doctor, you know, I see all these terrible situations and I'm visiting these isolated areas. is there any way that you can assist me? And you know, Kim, he said to me, Ken, he said, I've just been praying, asking God to help us know how we as a hospital can help beyond our own local area.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Isn't it a great God that he just brings together his people who are praying?
Yes.
And so this began a very small way to start with, what we really call a flying doctor service. So our bush flying turned into a flying doctor service.
Well, that is truly an answer to prayer. Do you have any other stories that you could share with us?
Sure. Oh, with the flying doctor, one of the places we went to was Sissamon. And up the valley, unbeknownst to us, there was a tribe that had never met a white person, never come out into the wider community. And so they had heard about how this big bird that they had actually seen flying, and this great noisy bird, this is real, they had seen this noisy bird fly, and they'd heard about this bird had landed down the river further and spat out a black man and a white man. And then this black man helped all these people, and then the bird ate them up again and flew off. And this is real. This is how they had heard the story, and they were just absolutely...
I can understand that with the lack of understanding about technology and what have you. This would have been a really bizarre thing for them to see.
And that was fine. You know, that was sort of, we don't have anything to do with that. You know, that bird terrified them.
Yeah,
but then a lady in their community, she got a very bad ulcer, and it was eating away her leg, and she was actually dying. And so they sent word down to this other tribe and said, look, this lady's dying, we need help. Can whoever's helping you, can they help us? And so when we landed, the local folk told us about this. And we said, well, why don't they come down and get help? And they said, well, they're too scared. They're scared the bird will eat them, you know. And there was this terrible tension. And so I said to the local folk, I said, well, then why don't you go up and get them? Oh, no, they're a different tribe, you know. And so we said, well, hang on, they need help. We're helping you. And so it's quite a long story, but eventually we convinced them to go up and bring this lady back. So we waited and waited. The next day, the children quickly told us there was a raft coming down the river. And so everyone was looking out, but it was only the guys who'd gone to get the lady. When they came back, they said that the tribe were just so terrified they wouldn't let the lady come. And so it was a really tragic story in many ways, because the lady died. We heard a couple of months later when we came back that she had died, and we think, well, you know, what's the point of all of this? But a couple of months after that, I landed the aircraft on this amazing airstrip, Sissamon, and came up to the cliff face at the top of the airstrip, and there, sitting on the side, were two guys of a build that I had not seen before. And they were wearing very little, you know, according to their own tradition. And I thought, hey, who is this? And so when I turned the aircraft around and positioned it right, because you do, in these bush airstrips, you have to position the aircraft ready for the takeoff. And so positioned the aircraft, stopped the engine, and then got out. And the local folks said, these are two men from that tribe. And the look in their eyes, Kim, was just absolute terror. Here's this bird that they had seen flying, a noisy bird. Now they were seeing it for real. They were seeing it spit out, this black man and white man, you know. And so they were just terrified, and they just sat there. And I gave them the space. And so we tended to the local folk and so on, and they just kept watching. And we were there overnight. And so overnight, they just kept their distance further while we kept with the lantern. They kept working on folk who needed help. And the next morning, they allowed us to come and actually come close to them. And so that was just the beginnings. But eventually, folk from that tribe started coming down and But not only were we able to help them physically, of course, we were able to tell them the story of Jesus. And so it's a tragic story about the loss of that lady's life. But in some ways, that was the catalyst to helping that tribe get help physically and ultimately learn about Jesus and get eternal help.
Ken, that is an incredible story. Coming up next, we find out why Cupbearer is Ken's spiritual inspiration. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. Here with me is Senior Church Administrator, Pastor Ken Vogel. Ken, I have really enjoyed our stories. They have been fantastic. Ken, you've shared to us your story, your upbringing about living on a dairy farm. We've talked about your life as a church pastor and then a bush pilot and working in the outback as well as working in Papua New Guinea. Now, being a missionary myself and living in Papua New Guinea for 4 years, I was really interested in the different builds and the different languages that you were talking about. So, yeah.
Well, it is. That particular group, for example, they were just literally up the valley, only about a day's walk, and yet they spoke a totally different language to the others. And so there's over 700 different languages and dialects in Papua New Guinea of, 4 to 5 million people.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so just incredible. And different builds, you know, the Highlanders are different to the coastals, and then you get different coloured skin. So yeah, very different. But they're all Melanesian and all lovely people. They really are. Papua New Guineans are just great. And with the language issues, because there's so many different languages, they have created a Melanesian pidgin.
That's right.
And Melanesian pidgin is just an amazing mix of English and Portuguese and French and German and some local languages, and it's just, you know, oli savi talking this talk now, oli hamamas long haru. So you understand.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that. Now, we've been talking about these really interesting things. I wanted to talk to you about your spiritual inspiration. We were talking before about the fact that you have a cupbearer as your spiritual inspiration. Tell us more about that.
Well, I relate to the cupbearer in the Bible, Nehemiah, so much, because he's a guy that really didn't plan to be what he ended up being. As you know, you've been hearing my story, you know, it's just God has taken me on a journey and I've done things I would never dreamt of doing. And that's the story of Nehemiah in the Bible. You know, Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king of Persia. He lived in the capital of Persia, you know, in Susa, and so here he is based there. That's his life journey. I mean, his people, the Israelites, they had gone back from captivity to their home base, and but he had stayed on in Persia. That was now his life. That was where he was staying, and so that's where he thought he would always be. But he didn't.
No. He wasn't always a cupbearer for them.
No, he didn't, because some family members came to visit who had gone back to Jerusalem. And so he said to them, as he would, you know, how's everything going back home? And their answer was just, he said, his family members said, it's terrible. Our people are shamed. You know, the walls are still broken down, there's no gates, the temple hasn't been rebuilt. And so Nehemiah was a man of God who, like my parents and like I hope in my own experience and life journey, we actually have, you know, your faith is real. It's not just a belief, not a theoretical belief. And so he took it to God in prayer. And like I did with the Flying Doctor, he took this to God in prayer.
And where did Nehemiah go from there?
Well, he did. It was about, the Bible says, the story says that for about 4 months, it would seem, because when he first asked the question of his family member to where he ultimately started this amazing new journey, it was about 4 months. So he had prayed and he said to God, look, God, you know, my people and myself, my own family, you know, we've made some terrible mistakes, but you are an amazingly gracious God and you have plans for us, and it's not happening. But you must make it happen, God, but how? And so he was really struggling with this. And one day he came into the king to serve him as normal, and the king says, hey, Nehemiah, what's wrong with you? You know, you're not sick, but you look terrible, and that's not you. You know, what's going on? And so Nehemiah, again, the Bible says that he actually, it says here that he actually prayed quickly to God. It's clear from the scriptures, you know, he prayed quickly to God and he said, God, help me, you know. And so then he says to the king, well, this is the situation. And he goes on and asks the king for some amazing things. He'd obviously prepared in this mind, you know, and so he asked the king for letters of security. He asked the king for permission, even, I mean, the cheek of it, to ask this king, who has no need to be worried about this people that are over there, but he asked the king for permission to use trees from the forest and so on. And look, I love it. Can I just read a little bit from it? Because the way it turns out, I just love the way Nia puts it. He says here, and because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. You know, Nehemiah didn't say, you know, I was pretty good about that, you know, I just said it right. And no, he said he prayed to God and he gave God the credit. And what the king did was amazing. So he gave him those letters that he had asked for, but it says here in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 9, it says, the king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Oh. I mean, you know, so he asked for...
supported the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. You know, so he asked for a certain amount, and God speaks to the king in his own way, and the king responds. The king obviously was a good man and was open to God's leading himself. Oh, and so Nehemiah, the cupbearer, all of a sudden goes back to Jerusalem and becomes a project manager for a major construction site. I mean, you know, he's serving the king, these things that the king would only allow someone who he trusts to serve him. And so he's basically a butler and that sort of thing, but fairly high level. And he becomes a construction site project manager. You know, just that's why he's my inspiration, because that's the way I've seen God work in my life too, that I have gone to do things I would never have imagined doing, but by letting God lead in one's life, it is really quite exciting. I mean, he wouldn't have dreamt of becoming that. And so the story goes on of how Nehemiah continues in his whole life journey putting God first. And he's also a very wise man. I love this about Nehemiah, because he gets to Jerusalem, and it says here in chapter 2 verse 11, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. And so here Nehemiah is sort of just taking it very cautiously. He's not coming and sort of riding and saying, oh, everybody, I'm here, we're going to do this, you know. It's just very wisely, carefully, and as you read on, you realise prayerfully, he's actually taking this step by step. So he goes out during the night just on his own to check out really what is the situation. What is this thing I've actually come to do here, you know? So he goes around and he actually checks out the walls, they're broken down, the gates, the temple, the gates near the temple particularly is mentioned, you know. And so he sees this is a huge venture. And so here says, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God. When he eventually comes back and actually opens up with the leaders and says, folk, you know, I am here with the authority of the king of Persia, but I'm here because God has sent me. By his grace, we are come here to rebuild these walls, to rebuild these gates, to rebuild Jerusalem's temple, so that our God is honoured again, you know. And so he brings us to them, and the people respond so positively to this. And so, you know, he says, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God. He said, God's led to this. And that helped the people feel confident, you know. And I think that's been my experience too, where I have helped people only because God has helped me. And, you know, telling that story to you earlier about my little brother, that was hard to tell, Kim. But if we tell part of our life journey and where God has led, where God has helped us and worked through us, or just helped to lift us up, it does help others. And so Nehemiah, you know, he says that. And I love their response. In verse 18 it says, they replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work, you know. It was a really lovely sort of way that people responded. Why? Because Nehemiah was a great builder who had come to help them? No, he was just a cupbearer. But what excited them was his vision, and also not just his vision, but actually his prayer that God had led, by God's grace he was there, so by God's grace that was going to be rebuilt, and it was.
Oh, great. Ken, thank you so much. That is fantastic. Thank you so much for joining with us, and we hope to see you next time.